Have you been wondering how these six know-it-alls got together? Well, back in 2020, after 6 months of COVID-19 pandemic isolation, Barbara Brackman decided she needed some company. She invited 5 quilty friends to join her for Zoom cocktail parties every other Monday evening in order to discuss the state of the country and maybe some quilts too. So convivial were the Zooms that they decided to gather virtually every week instead of every 2 weeks. Quilt soon became the main focus of these discussions, of course. Questions were raised, pondered, and discussed, debated, and occasionally settled about particular examples that were brought to the party. Julie Silber then declared that surely the public would be fascinated by their discussions. And so the six know-it-alls, a tongue firmly in cheek name, was born. It quickly became apparent that technical help was required, so Tara Miller of the Quilt District came on board. After 3 freebie sessions, the six know-it-alls, all professional quilt historians with a combined experience of a quarter of a millennium, began to charge for the programs. We're so happy you could join us.
Hi, it's Barbara Brackman, and I'm one of the 6 know-it-alls, but today we have an extra guest know-it-all, so we're very excited. We're going to talk about quilts that interest us and that we want input from our friends, and we hope you're going to enjoy our discussion. We see Merikay's working on her display behind her there. So we have only 4 know-it-alls talking today. And we have 7 know-it-alls commenting and answering questions. So it'll be extra fun to have extra guests. And our guest is Alex Anderson. And are we thrilled? But we're going to start with our friend Debby Cooney, who's one of the original 6 know-it-alls. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. She lives in Virginia. Am I right? No.
Maryland.
Maryland, well, you know, I live in Kansas. It's all the same back there. Okay, she lives in Maryland, and she's a quilt collector who specializes in quilts of Maryland and the vicinity, especially Pennsylvania and Virginia too. And with Rhonda McAllen, she's researched and written much about Baltimore albums. If you want to know if it's designer number 1 or designer number 2, she's your woman. So Debby, let's hear what you've got today. Can you share your screen?
Okay. Fraktur is a style of black letter script first used in the German states in the early 16th century. Fraktur lettering is broken or fractured into disconnected and angular parts. It was used widely in German-speaking areas of Europe and the US into the 20th century. Fraktur script is sometimes embellished with colors and decorative motifs. This artistic form flourished in German-speaking communities in Pennsylvania, Ohio, the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and other areas from the earliest days of settlement. Germanic calligraphers decorated religious texts, book plates, paintings, and more for a population that grew with waves of immigration to the US in the 18th and 19th centuries. One popular item of calligraphers' work was the Geburt und Taufschein, my German is terrible, a record of a child's birth and baptism commissioned by the parents. The earliest were entirely hand inscribed and painted in inks and watercolors, but by the late 18th century, many letterpress printed versions were available with blank areas where names, places, and dates could be filled in either by the family member or by the artists. The colors were added by the print shop or the calligrapher. Some of these artists were known by name or by style. They and their work were cataloged in an authoritative 4-volume work by Corinne and Russell Ernest, Papers for Birthdays, Guide to the Fraktur Artists and Scriveners. One prolific scrivener in filling such Taufscheins was dubbed the footed letter scrivener because the legs of his capital letters M, N, and K kick out like a foot. He was active from the 1830s to 1860 in Lehigh and several other counties in southeastern Pennsylvania. He used red ink where the others usually used black. Pennsylvania German women began making quilts in substantial numbers in the second quarter of the 19th century. Before then, woven wool coverlets were their bed covers of choice, thanks to Germanic traditions and numerous American coverlet weavers. The German language did not have a word for quilt, so the word Teppich is used, which translates roughly into rug. Name-inscribed friendship quilts became popular around 1840, with the earliest produced in Quaker communities in southeastern Pennsylvania and New Jersey around Philadelphia. Perhaps it was inevitable that Fraktur lettering would appear on Pennsylvania German friendship quilts, like this one for Christina Schultz. Back in 2004, Lucinda Colley published the scholarly paper Ihr Teppich, in other words, her quilt or her rug, Quilts and Fraktur, in the 2004 volume of Uncoverings, the Journal of the American Quilt Study Group. She located and discussed more than 20 examples dating between 1851 and 1870. I bought this one marked with the scrivener's name, but Cinda had no information on it. His block reads, Geschrieben von George H.L. Strela, that is written by George H.L. S-T-R-A with an umlaut for E, H-L-E. Many of his letters have the kicked out foot. At first, I found nothing about him on decorative arts or genealogy sites. Then Ancestry eventually uploaded wills from Lehigh County with George's name anglicized to Straley and a death date of 1860, the year that the Ernest reported that the footed letter scrivener had stopped working. I had found him. George Heinrich Luther Straley was born in Germany in 1794 and emigrated to the US in the 1820s. He and his American-born wife and children settled in Allentown, seat of Lehigh County. By the 1830s, he was infilling Topshines, probably as a sideline to his other work. He seems to have begun inscribing quilt blocks in the early 1850s. He inscribed a Topshine for Daniel Desch in 1846 and a quilt for Daniel's sister Anna Maria Desch in 1853. The lettering on these pieces is too similar to think that anyone but Straley could be the footed letter scrivener. I have not learned enough to know why his name appears on this quilt inscribed Christina Schultz, her Ihr Teppich 1859. Her parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles included here were all born and many lived at Allentown, but some closer connection must have existed. Christina was 19 in 1859, so perhaps the quilt was made in anticipation of marriage. Straley surrounded her name with a laurel wreath, a motif seen in all of his dedication blocks. Jonathan Kemmerer, suggested as the footed letter scrivener by one group of researchers, but dismissed by Cinda, was in fact a friend of the Straley family. John Straley, George's son, is listed in the household of Jonathan Kemmerer in the US 1850 census. Jonathan probably inscribed his own block on this quilt for his sister Susanna. His lettering is bold and heavy, while the names on all the other blocks are slender and graceful like Susanna's, and is certainly in George's style. I have now counted up 31 quilts, tops, and pillowcases inscribed by George Straley, by far the largest number of textile items marked by any Fraktur scrivener known. He inscribed 10 quilts presently in the International Quilt Museum collection, and these are in chronological order. The resolution of the photographs on their website is just large enough to make out the laurel wreath dedication and his typical cross bows beneath other names. Straley died in December of 1860. Some potential clientele apparently went to scrivener William Gross, who made his identity obvious by inscribing his name with a pot of droopy tulips in the dedication block. And this one is particularly handsome. This one has its inscription up in the upper right-hand corner in the border, which is an odd place to put it, but at least it's there. Gross also signed his tough shines just below the inscription block. I hope one day to find a tough shine or some other piece of Fraktur signed by Straley to add to his legacy of beautiful artistry. The end.
It's wonderful. Mhm.
Well,
Before
I-
you quit, go up a couple to some quilts. I want to look at the quilts. I got some pictures, which you haven't. I am struck as a person who's interested in style by how early these quilts reflect a style that nobody else did until the 1880s. That giant wide border, the very heavy sashing with the real emphatic, square that is in the intersection, and the real control color. If you compare these 1850 quilts to what people were making in Philadelphia or Charleston or Maryland, they're so minimal, so graphic. And for a long time, I was thinking, well, maybe they're put together later, but there's too many of them. So all I got to say here is that these people kind of predicted style, and other people must have seen that style and thought, well, I'm going to put giant sashing and giant borders on my quilt. Now, not only in Pennsylvania, but elsewhere.
I hadn't thought of that until you mentioned it. And you're right. I just always think of them as something else because they're Pennsivania German. And while that community was certainly not isolated, it was very, it was to some extent, very intertwined. I mean, and so when they came up on a style, they spread it around to their friends, and apparently from there it must have gotten out into the English or the non-Germans.
As we are. Also, they invented the applique quilt too, I feel.
Well,
and because they had the tin patterns, because they had pattern, not only tin, but paper. And that was a very long-term German tradition of folk arts that were handed down with patterns. They could be dispersed to other people, and the English picked them all up. I mean, you see over and over again, red and green as a very Germanic folk art color scheme. And then also, we're going to talk later about some of the formats here, that the way the flowers are arranged in the square is very Germanic folk arts.
Mm-hmm.
My interest in these quilts are the inking, which, as you know, from my various and sundry presentations, I argue are inspired by the reticule bags that women inked in the 18 teens. So, and I have noticed the same motifs on these bags as appear in some of these inked friendship quilts. And so one of my burning research questions is finding the intersection here. And so you're saying that this community was the first to do these inked inscriptions?
Oh, no, not necessarily. It's just that the Fraktur tradition is so strong that they were going to find a way to put Fraktur on just about everything, and they did.
Okay.
It's all over the place.
Can you remind me what his birth date was?
1794.
So it's possible that he was doing some of these white work bags, these reticules.
I hope to find, I hope to find more. Whenever Fraktur items come up in the various search engines, I look at them all to see if I can find some overlap, because I would love to know if he did other kinds of things, or if there was a whole school that did other sorts of Fraktur.
Except Lynn, all the inked bags I've ever seen have had New England provenance. Have you ever seen bags that are known to be coming out of Pennsylvania?
I've certainly, yes. Okay. They're not just a New England thing.
Okay.
There's even that dress in the just thinking about ink work in general, that dress that is that the colonial Williamsburg has a Virginia
Oh,
history.
that's true. That's true. Okay, sure.
I have a question, Debbie. Were these scriveners hired to do the work?
Yes, they were. Yes. And I have, the only thing that pops up for Straley is 1850 census. He was listed as a shoemaker. And by 1860, he was a peddler. So I think his health had declined by then. But they clearly couldn't make a living doing this unless they produced enormous amounts of work. So I think it was probably for a sideline for a lot of them. And some of the schoolmasters were well known in some places in Pennsylvania as Fraktur artists. But yeah, it was probably a sideline.
I'm also struck that all of those things were the same exact pattern, the same pieced pattern. And
Rolling stone. Rolling stone.
So
yeah,
far, only 3.
that was fascinating. And 31, I cannot believe it. That's just extraordinary that you found all of those and you've connected the dots. It's so exciting when you can really connect those research dots with the documentation and say, this is the person. It's very exciting.
If only it didn't take
I'm
so
gonna
many
make this
years to
move on.
do it.
Yeah.
This is my signal. It's time to move on.
Oh, you
Okay.
horrible woman. Okay, Julie is next. Julie is an old friend. She lives in California. I'm right on that, I hope. And she's been collecting quilts for much of her adult life. Maybe even as a small child, I don't know. She's a premier quilt dealer, one of the world's most famous quilt dealers. And she's curated numerous exhibits over her many decades in the business, including a groundbreaking 1976 exhibit called Quilts and Women's Lives at the Oakland Museum. So Julie, what are you gonna entertain us with today?
Well, I'm going to talk about something that came to me because I am a dealer and seller and buyer of antique quilts, and this is a really current story. And let's see, I sold this quilt about 2 months ago, and I sold it to a woman in England. Sent it off, and my quilts always go on approval, and people have the right for any reason to return them. Let's look a little bit at what these wonderful fabrics, turn of the century, printed in solid fabric, cottons. That it's just a wonderland of those fabrics. I sent it off fully expecting that it was crisp, it was in perfect condition, there was nothing wrong with it. And that's not exactly what happened. I got a note from her saying she loved the quilt. And when she got it out of the box, she started looking over the fabrics and boom, what did she see? This fabric. You can see that it has what we call a swastika. What is a swastika in one of the triangles? I had not seen it because there's just such an array of designs, but she did. She was naturally and understandably very offended by it and wanted to return the quilt, which of course I allowed her to do. But we also started to have a conversation because I wanted her to know that that symbol has not always symbolized evil. In fact, for 15,000 years or more, it appears in almost every culture that we know, and always for positive reasons. It comes from the Sanskrit word swastika, and it means good things, good fortune, long life, prosperity. It appears on temples, on walls of people's homes. It just shows up all the time. Here we have a fragment of what's said to be a 12th century princess's collar, and an Etruscan pendant from BC at the Louvre. Here in Copenhagen is the Carlsberg Brewery Company, and this is the entranceway. This was designed in 1901. And we see quilts. We see quilts with this symbol, and we see them a lot. It's a logical construction around geometric shapes. But all the ones I've ever seen, and there are many, date before World War II, including these two that you're looking at right here. This came at a time when this symbol stood for very good things. Here's one in the collections of the International Quilt Museum. They dated 1870 to 1890. I can't see the fabrics, but I think all of us would agree that it was then or a little bit later, but certainly before World War II and before the Nazi era. It was so widespread. We see it on good luck coins. I love this one, which is the Don't Worry Club over here. It says, keep this with me and you will always have good luck. It's just everywhere. This is a cigar label. California fruit label. I think these are playing cards. I think that's just beautiful. And this on the left, check this out. A cap opener, a bottle cap opener. Drink Coca-Cola in bottles, 5 cents. And Pepsi-Cola went right for it and said, good luck. It's so ubiquitous. It's amazing. Here and all around the world. Native American culture had it as a good luck sign here on a Navajo blanket, here on the uniforms of some Arizona Native Americans, 1909. And in Canada, it's all over the place. These are 3 hockey teams, 1910 to 1922, and they were called the Edmonton swastikas, the Windsor swastikas. It was a good thing. This is even a town in Ontario, Canada, and a street sign also in Ontario. So what happened? This is what happened. The monster came along and brought along with him too many German people and decided to co-opt the symbol. They had some crazy idea that it had come from India and meant white warrior. And so they took it on as a symbol, co-opted it and corrupted it. And here's what Hitler himself said. I came to a final form, a flag with a background of red with a white circle and in its center a black swastika. This was kept. And then he says, we see our program in our flag. Social idea of the movement in the white, the national idea, there we go, white supremacy right there. The victory of the Aryan man, and that's a whole thing about India. The victory of the idea of creative work, which in itself is and will always be anti-Semitic. It was everywhere then after he co-opted it and took it over. The Reichstag building, a plane that's been downed apparently with the symbol. And here's a poster. I thought this was interesting. It's Hitler über Deutschland, not Deutschland über alles. The guy took over and took too many people along with him. Circling back, I want to circle back because we see it so widely before the, I'm going to go back here just for a second. Merikay at
World's Fair.
Notice that that's a World's Fair button. And what do we say? Good luck, World's Fair, and then the all good luck symbols. But I want to circle back to when, before World War II, when we see the symbol on quilts. And this is a quilt now in the collection of International Quilt Museum that I once owned. It's dated 1932, and you can see that here is the symbol, and then it's interlocked around here. It was made, ironically, by a woman named Mary German in 1932. I thought this was hilarious because I bet you money that she wrote by Mary A. German 1932, and someone, perhaps her husband, came along and said, you get Mrs. in there, you don't, you. But this, here's something I noticed in doing this work. This is the Schaffer Hotel and Dining Room in Mountain Air, New Mexico. It's still there. It still looks like this. It was built in 1923. Let me show you, here's the building. This is a bed in this hotel. Get this. This is Mrs. German's quilt, and this is a bedspread, a new bedspread, but still incorporating what appeared to be Navajo or some Native American symbols. And I'm just wondering if I just saw a connection between this symbol and this, and obviously the swastika. I want to circle back. I'm going to finish up now on what happened to the quilt. the quilt came back to me. I had this nice conversation with the woman, and then I relisted it, making sure that I had noted that there was this small figure that resembled a swastika, and centuries before, I told the whole story, I circled it, and someone else bought it. I wrote to her, and before I sent the quilt, I wrote to her and said, told the story, that it appears, I completely understand, it was returned, I understand the discomfort, accepted the quilt. To be clear, the quilt was made before Hitler co-opted the symbol for evil, blah, blah, blah. And then I gave her a link to a very informative article about the origin, the meaning, and the co-opting of the symbol. And I said to her, still, I would not want you to be surprised. I'll wait to hear back from you before sending the quilt out. And she wrote back and said, thank you, Julie, as you can see. As history brings both bright and dark side of life, we could just hope that we learn from it. Best, Sue. Happy ending. That's my story.
Man, you did a lot of work on that. That's the
Yes.
best discussion I've ever heard of that symbol.
Well, how widespread it was is what surprised me so much. It was everywhere. And now, you know, also, as I was saying to you before we got on air here, there are movements now to try to take the symbol back, because for 15, 17,000 years or more, or whatever, it was good. And the whole idea of taking back a slur or a negative connotation, we've seen it happen before, and there are people who are trying to do it now. I found quite a bit about that on the net.
That would be great, because there's been some real destructive reaction to it. I know of one instance where a dealer had a flour sack displayed in her booth with the swastika symbol from, you know, pre-World War II. And a visitor was just
Horrified.
not just horrified, but reacted with such vigor against that dealer. She basically put her out of business.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I know too that there are Hindus and Buddhists who carry that symbol on their various ways, and they're discriminated against it, because that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this talk, is that so people get a larger context and begin to understand that he took it, and we
He
should
appropriated it.
appropriate it.
Yeah, that's a really good instance of using the word appropriated as a
And of
bad
course, it's, you know, it's back up now as a symbol of evil. It's back up. So we have,
Yeah, we see it all the time,
as
unfortunately.
Lynn is pointing out, we have to be able to distinguish between when it was, the intention, and when it was shown, and what it means in the historical context.
Well, on our questions and answers Facebook page, I think I'll put up some more applique things in the 19th century that were so Pennsylvania German, which we've been talking about, where that fylfot, it's hard for me to say that, was the structure. That was German folk arts. They loved that whirling cross, it was often called, and it fit in a square so perfectly. And so many of our applique patterns, fortunately, it doesn't jump out of us.
What you're talking about, Barbara, I think, is that the stems, if you took away the flowers and the leaves, the stems make a cross
in concentric fashion.
Yes.
Yeah, and it works really well. But it's definitely Germanic folk arts and very traditional.
Which is probably another reason it resonated for Hitler, because it would visually resonate with what the aesthetics they were familiar with. And he was so much into trying to tap into the folk culture and revive the, you know, German folk, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, the whole idea of folk arts with nationalism was very intertwined in the early 20th century. Well, are we ready to move on? Oh, there's a flash. Well, let's go on to our guest. We're so excited to have Alex Anderson here. She's an old friend of several of us. and an old friend of Julie Silver. And she is going to, well, let me tell you a little bit about her. She lives in California. Her love of quilting began when she was in art school. And she finished a grandmother's flower garden quilt that she'd been working on and turned it in for her project. And unlike me, who tried the same thing, she got a grade. So I was fascinated by the fact that that was her background. And she says she's really not a know-it-all. She's a sew-it-all. She's a founding member, a founding partner, excuse me, of the Quilt Show, which is what we aspire to be here in the Six Know-It-Alls. So take it away, Alex.
Okay, here we go. When I was asked to be a know-it-all, I said to Barbara, but I'm not a know-it-all. I'm not a know-it-all. I listened to these women here and all the history that they have and everything. And she said, no, you just have to say you're a know-it-all. And you are one. So thank you, Barbara. And then today I came up with, I'm a sew-it-all. I have been quilting since the 70s, and I think about what was available to us at that point, and we would just go look after pattern after pattern after pattern and make quilts. And I think one of the first books I got, Barbara, was actually yours. And it's after culling all of my books, I still have your books because it's a vast area of where we can get ideas. I would literally sit down, look at the book, pick out a block, and then go pick out the fabric, and there you go. But then at some point, I ran across this quilt of Julie Silver's Universe. And this particular quilt completely haunted me. I look at that quilt and I think, what, I'm going to assume it was a woman. What was that woman going through? I mean, it must have been, I'm just glad she didn't have a rotary cutter. Okay. There's a simplicity here. There is a beautiful graphic appeal to it, but there's also kind of a sense of craziness. So this quilt haunted me for, I'd say, what, 4 or 5 years, Julie. And then I got hold of you and I said, look, would you mind if I did a modern, version of this? And she said, no problem. I always feel like, if I'm going to take a riff off of somebody else's quilt that they own, I need to ask permission. And so I thought this is a great scrap quilt. I went to the local quilt shop and spent $500 on my next scrap quilt. And I want to take a look at the blocks up close before I show you my finished project. It is very rough. It is very crude. And when I went to go and make it, I thought, I can't make it like this person did. If you go to the top center row, there's that brown 9 patch, and then go down and there's the star. Nothing aligns. And how she got it all together, I don't know. So I knew instantly that I had to change how I was going to approach this whole thing. So let's take a look here. That's my quilt. It's called Universe 2. I love this quilt. Now, the challenge of this quilt was that you're working with a 9 patch and you're working with a 4 patch star. And mathematically, this does not go together, which I think is why the person had such a hard time and why it was so crude. I asked Julie, what were the block sizes? And you just have to love this as the answer. Between 3.5 or 2.5 and 3 or 3.5 and, whatever. So obviously the person just made them and then figured out, I'm going to get it together no matter what. So all of a sudden I started paying attention to these quilts that are really different. I had never really seen these quilts before. And I actually have a question for the know-it-alls when I get done here. I saw this, I believe this was on Julie's Facebook page, and I almost had a heart attack over it because it is so filled with wonderful different blocks that you can find in Barbara Brackman's book. But the way the person put it together just knocked my socks off. So lo and behold, Ricky Timms bought it. And I said, no, I get to make the quilt from it. And he said, no, I get to make the quilt from it. And so we decided for the quiltshow.com to have a challenge. And we didn't see each other's quilts. Pay attention to the blocks and you'll see then what I dialed into and then what Ricky dialed into. So here is an innovative tulip pink meets K-facet quilt. And I pulled out the components that spoke to me. This was a blast to make, an utter blast. And then I will show you Ricky's. I got this image from him this morning, and this is his. And so I think it's so important to not just look at blocks of the past, but to look at quilts from the past. They have so much to teach us. And, you know, we can all say, well, this is new, this is innovative, whatever. But no, it's not. It's not at all. It's all been around. It's all been said. It's all been done. It's just a matter of respecting those before us and giving them honor. So this is the quilt that just unglued me. Just unglued me. Everything about this quilt I adore, and I can't quite remember where I got the image, but look at the fodder in that. Look at all the different things that you can make, blocks that come from this quilt. Now, how I go about making a quilt like this is I might sit down and say, okay, I'm going to make X block. I'm going to make 4 of them. I'm going to put them up on my wall. I try to work in mathematical increments that will go together easily, unlike Universe, the original maker of that. And then I put the blocks on my wall and just start sorting. So I'd like to show you, that's that one. And it's very modern. You can bet that some of that $500 worth of scraps that I got for the other ones in here, but I think that this is really a lovely representation of that quilt. Let's go back. I mean, I just think I don't even know who has this. It's just beautiful. So I don't quite understand these quilts in history, and I'm going to take that up to the know-it-alls because I just didn't see these in the 70s and 80s. We saw different kinds of quilts. And so I wondered, is this kind of a thing that was in, you know, like in maybe 1875 or something like that? I don't get it. And I don't even know if there's a style assigned to it. But I want to show you one last quilt of mine. And this is actually based on a quilt. Now, the quilt that I'm going to show you, I don't think it's old, but you could tell me, I'm pretty sure it was made probably about 20 or 30 years ago. But when I show you the image, it could easily have been made back in the day. And I apologize that I don't know the quilt maker's name because that's really bad. But this particular quilt, I was challenged with to do something modern. And so I looked at it and, you know, perhaps before being challenged to do something modern, I would have done a similar set because the set alone is beautiful. I mean, I can't even imagine how this would look in K-facet fabrics and things like that. But from that, I'll go back, I came to this. So what I want to say to everybody is, please look at these old quilts, pull out what you want, understand that, you know, these people, they really knew what was going on and we can learn from them. We are vessels of them. So know-it-alls, I have a question for you.
Okay.
And thank you for inviting me. I am a sew-it-all. Oh, and here's the quilt behind me. People want a pattern for that quilt. I can't give it to them because honestly, I don't know how I got it together and how I got it flat, but I did, like the woman back in, my guess is 1875, but Julie can correct me on that. Was this a style? What's the story on these quilts? Because they are incredible and they're kind of crazy.
Oh, I have a lot to say about this. I have a lot to say about
Julie, talk about it.
When I was talking to you, Alex and John, on the phone the other day, they were in the car and on speakerphone, her husband. Their question to me was put slightly differently. How come these all showed up at once? Like, how come we're just seeing them? What's going on? And it's very important for me to put out a theory, and I'm happy to be having us discuss it. These quilts have always been around. They just haven't been appreciated. when the new quilt revival, when the recent quilt revival of the last 50 years or whatever, the first thing that we seemed to appreciate were the finely made, very finely made, million stitches, Baltimore album quilts. These, I had a shop from 1971 to 81 here in Northern California. If I got a quilt that looked like this, I might love it, but it would get a $25 price tag on it. They just weren't appreciated by the masses. And I'm not sure I appreciated them in the way I do now. They've been around. A lot of them were utility quilts in the sense that they were made to use, so they were used up, as opposed to a Baltimore album quilt doesn't get used up, it gets handed down. So what we see today is skewed. It's very skewed compared to what was actually made. And these quilts, which, for example, Rod Kirchhoff is calling unexpected and unconventional, I'm not so sure they're unexpected and unconventional. I think they were common. Whether they were great design or not is a question. But this improvisational kind of scrappy thing that you're talking about and calling maybe crazy, they've been around. We just didn't see them or appreciate them. That's what I think.
So you're saying that woman wasn't going through massive menopause?
No. There
But
are some. There definitely are some. But go, you guys. That's just what I think. Is they?
Oh,
Well,
yes. Go ahead.
I think the pandemic is showing quilts just like these. I think with time and trying to be resourceful, people are putting things together, unfinished projects, like they were doing back in the 1870s, 80s, because I do see them a lot in the 1870s and 80s. That Iora pool quilt I've shown before. We had quite a few in the South, but we didn't, during the quilt survey, we tried to get them to come out, but you're right. I don't think the families may have thought that those are the ones we wanted to
That's a really
document.
important point, Merikay, because I remember having my eyes open when Jeanette Lisansky got on board long ago when the quilt estate documentation projects came around. She was the first person I heard say, don't have a quilt documentation day. People will just bring what they consider their best stuff. Go to their homes and ask them to see everything. If your goal is to see what's typical. If your goal is to get the best, you can have a quilt documentation day and they'll bring the best. If you want to know what was really made in this county of Pennsylvania, go to their houses and ask them to show you even their most worn quilt.
well, and that's the thing, is that I suspect those were the ones that really did get worn out and used on a regular basis and ended up being dog beds and scraps and, you know, thrown away and so on. So we're lucky that these do survive, because, you know, the best ones, you know, it's like, why are there so bloody many wedding dresses in museum collections? Because it was not used, it was saved, the ball dresses, the special occasion, saved for the best guest room. Those are the ones that get preserved. So there were probably a whole lot more of these.
Well, I agree with that for sure. As someone who has been going to auctions often from the 90s on, especially in Maryland and Pennsylvania, the best quilts that they thought would sell to dealers were hung at a different place. They were like hung from clotheslines. And the utility type quilts or the scrappy quilts ended up in the box lots, you know, out in the field with the detergent that came from under the sink. I mean, it was, and they sold for like, you know, $5. So it wasn't, it took a while even before I started to notice them. But I'm sure that they were there if people wanted to look for them back in the 90s.
I was telling Alex on the phone that the G-Spend exhibition opened our eyes in a way that we didn't pay attention to, because Bill and Matt Arnett found these quilts. They went to 25 museums before Houston, the curator Houston, saw what they were talking about. Once the quilts went up on the wall in a major museum with lights on them, seen in the way that they should be seen.
Yeah.
The scales fell away from so many people's eyes, you know? Suddenly they were looking at them and seeing the genius in some of them in
Yeah.
design and so on. So,
But then speaking to what you were saying that that Jean or Jeanette Lasansky said,
Lasansky.
sorry, thank you. I remember reading around the time that the G-SPEN first was going around, that when the guy who sort of, discovered and publicized them and so on first went into their homes, he'd say, oh, he would, make a beeline for these things that we now are all excited about. And often the quilt maker would say, that's not my best one. Let me show you my best one. That's just some old, So, they weren't even valuing it as much. And they wanted to show what they thought was their best. And he was seeing, no, let's take a look at these. So, I think that's very similar to what you're describing about the quilt project, that you have to go and say, no, show me everything.
Okay, we've got to move on. We've got to move
But
on.
see, the power of this is to let me get a last little comment.
Then you get to say something. I'm timekeeper next time.
And my comment is just that I think we needed to go through a period of education, and modern art did that for us.
That's true.
Our 20th century modern art trained us to understand the graphic quality of these quilts, and I think a lot of these quilts maybe were accidentally brilliant, but they were still but they're still brilliant. They're still brilliant, but I don't know that they were necessarily shooting for that.
No, they were shooting for getting rid of scraps and keeping family warm.
But anyway,
All right, we have to move
now,
on. We have to move on.
another
And we're going to go to our last speaker, Merikay, who lives in Tennessee. And she collects quilts and is an independent scholar who's created many museum shows over the years. And she and I have been working together for decades. And our favorite show that we've done, and we did it together, is called Patchwork Souvenirs, Quilts from the 1933 World's Fair that traveled around, I believe, in the 90s. So Merikay, let's hear.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara. Right now in Boston, there's an exhibit on display at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Several of us in the quilts and the know-it-alls had something to do with the exhibit. And it was conceived 2 or 3 years ago prior to the pandemic, and it was delayed, but it now has opened in October, and it continues till January. And it's getting a lot of attention in the art world. Very good critical reviews all over the country. It is called Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories. The quilt on the cover of the book and the kind of center quilt is a quilt done by Bisa Butler. She's having a great year. She's had a one-woman show at the Art Institute, and she's just a spectacular quilt maker. And I'm pleased to see that at least 2 quilts that were in the, well, I think we can recognize some quilts here in this screenshot I took from their website, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. There's some familiar pieces there. And right in the center is a quilt that I once owned. But Barbara and I are going to talk a little bit about those 2, the 2 Sears quilts that are in this exhibit. Now, last week, our trusted technology person, Tara Miller, took a camera to the Boston Museum of Art and had 2 hours of time there alone in the galleries, and interviewed the curator and looked at all the quilts on display. And you can see here the variety of quilts. They're very modern ones. This big sphere is something I remember, I think from the 70s or 80s. And there are these 2 quilts that come from the Sears quilt contest. Now, Barbara and I I consider the high point of my career of research. Both of these quilts really captured my attention and kept me looking for more and more details about their makers. And here's Tara with the curator, Jennifer Swope, as they were discussing the quilt on display. And she has a nice video that's already on her website on YouTube at the Quilt District. And a lot of these pictures she provided today. So these are really up-to-date pictures of the exhibit. So here are the two quilts. The Spectrum on the left by Edith Matthews in 1933. We like this quilt, especially because it was really the only first place winner in that contest that Barbara and I could include in the exhibit that we put together in 1993. The quilt on the right is, like I say, one I owned, and it was entered as an original design, but it did not win a prize. Now, this photo circulated, I think Barbara was the first one to find it, in Chicago at the Sears archives. And you could see that there is the Spectrum quilt right there on display. At the time, this was first published in places like Quilter's Newsletter and Quilter's Journal. They didn't know who made this quilt. But it turns out that this does show the top 9 quilts that won the regional prizes in that national quilt contest. They put on a display in 1934 to show just those winners, minus the one that went to Mrs. Roosevelt in Washington, D.C. So this exhibit, the quilt traveled to 11 museums in 1994-95. It was the first time it was seen in color, and the one on the right did not surface until an auction that I attended in North Georgia, of all places, in January of 1998. Now, this quilt, it just captivates anybody who looks at it, and any quilt maker is just amazed at these points. How Edith Matthews did this is just, we just can't figure it out. But it turns out it may not have been her first quilt. I think we wrote that it was, but people later, the family still owns this quilt, and they've since corrected some of the information. I feel like she was making quilts for in the Winnemucca, Nevada area for other people. Here she is standing in front of her quilt. She's 48 years old here, supposedly. And she was really proud of it. She kept all the letters that came from Sears. And because her letters were kept, we were able to find out a lot of information about the contest. Barbara actually wrote, I think, the earliest article about the contest in Quilter's Newsletter magazine in 1983. In it, she included a lot of those black and white pictures that Sears archives had provided. And one of them was the picture, that 1934 picture we just saw of the quilts on display. And someone saw that in the family, Edith Matthews' family, and contacted Barbara and said, we have this quilt, it's there, the second one from the left in the back. And that was the beginning of the interaction with Edith Matthews' family. Quilter's Journal, edited by good old Joyce Gross, did a whole issue on the Sears quilt contest. And I think she actually went to Edith Matthews' house and took pictures of the quilt, talked to the family, and photocopied all those letters. So that's why we have this picture of Edith Matthews, is because Joyce went there. And you remember this quilt photo I showed recently in one of the Know-It-Alls presentations about Ida Stowe, or maybe it was on the Quilt Side Chat for American Quilt Study Group. But we now know that these are the theme quilts that were shown again in 1934, and they primarily came from the Chicago area. Sears actually took their first black and white pictures of these quilts in 1934 because this exhibit was repeated. And so the quilt on the left was in black and white only, and it was taken, and Barbara actually had found this black and white photo. And it was such a clear photo, we could read the name tag in the bottom right, the entry tag, and it said made by Mrs. Louise Rowley on Thorndale Avenue. And I lived close to Thorndale Avenue in Chicago when I lived there. So I was really trying to find this quilt. We couldn't find it. I didn't know what the colors were. It was what we used in the book, Patchwork Souvenirs, to show the layout of the World's Fair site. So here we are using the quilt, but not knowing the color of it at all. And Adler Planetarium is the only building still left in Chicago from that fair site. And interestingly, this is looking from the kind of the loop area looking south, with Lake Michigan on the left and the city on the right. And here, when I went to that auction in 1998, walked in the building and saw the color of the quilt, it just took my breath away. And I didn't go in expecting to win the bid. There were people bidding by telephone, but I did. And I was thrilled to have gotten it and thrilled to have kept it, and was able to research it. The reason why I liked it was because I was from Chicago. It looked like, I love the way the sailboat is rendered, the buildings. The quilt maker had put the Sears building in the quilt, like a lot of entrants did, thinking, I think, that the judges would give them some extra points. But the quilt maker this quilt did not win. When I picked up the quilt in 1998, there was a note, handwritten note with it, and it came from the person who had given the quilt to be auctioned. They were not in the audience. And oh my gosh, I went to pay the money and they said, oh, here's a note. And I read it and it said, the real name of the quilt maker was Richard H. Rowley. He wrote his mother's name on the entry tag, thinking the judges would not believe that a man designed and made the quilt. And you could see that here is the name tag, and at the bottom it says, or at the top, it's written Mrs. Louise Rowley. A Century of Progress was the name they'd given it, and said it was made in 1933. And then it goes on with her address, etc. So with that information, I tried to find Richard Rowley in the genealogy, and it took a lot of doing, and I'm not sure we have time to go into all of it, but I did actually find him, and I went back to the auction house months later, and maybe years later, and they still had a photo album that they had not auctioned. And here was a picture of Richard Rowley. So Richard Rowley, known to his friends and family as Harry Rowley, worked as an architectural draftsman in Chicago, in New York, and in California. And he died in North Georgia in 1968. So I want to thank the Boston Museum of Art and Tara and the families of those two quilt makers. And I understand that the rest of us have stories too to tell about researching some of those quilts. So
Wonderful.
what do you think?
Wonderful.
I'm excited to see the exhibit. My ticket is for December 1st.
Oh, you have to buy tickets ahead of time, huh?
And yeah, you have to buy tickets ahead of time, both because of the pandemic, I think, and because it's so popular. And I was honored to receive a catalog from one of the curators, Lauren Whitley, which thank goodness I have, because I guess now I'm writing a review of it for Salvage magazine.
Okay. Hey, Merikay, you can stop sharing.
Share. Okay.
Stop sharing.
But what
Well,
a
you know,
wonderful
I have to give you
discovery.
some background. Merikay and I both are not from Chicago, but we lived in Chicago. Now, Alden's from Chicago. Alden's from
I
Chicago.
have-
We lived
I
there
have
mostly for
plenty of time
school.
together.
And so we always loved it. And when I was up there for a couple of years teaching at the University of Illinois, I got into this whole idea of this contest, and I made friends with the woman who was the archivist at Sears. And so I would go down there into the Sears Tower, and she would show me stuff she had. Now, why at this point in 1980, they still had this archivist? You know, she's long gone. And all the stuff is probably long gone, but she gave me copies of the photos. And so that's what got me started on this. And also, living in Chicago, I went to junk stores and I collected every souvenir I could find of that World's Fair. It was just an extravaganza of small junk and large stuff too. So I really had an affection for the fair. And Merikay and I just started doing this. We found 20,000 entries were entered in that fair. Is that right?
way.
I can't
There
believe
were-
it every time I say it.
We
And
only
did it
found,
before.
yeah, we found about
20,000 people
300.
entered that fair in 1933, the depths of the Depression. And that's because Sears offered $1,000 for the
Wow.
first prize. Now that was enormous. And people like Richard, I'm sure it just exploded hopes in their mind. And they had just like 4 months to get this done, 5 or 6 the most. But the judges did not care for any of the modern quilts. And so the judges awarded prizes to very traditional quilts. And all these people who had done all this creative stuff, the only exception was Edith Matthews with her Spectrum, which was darn modern. Everybody else was very disappointed. And so it's a wonderful story that we go over and over. And Merikay decided we'd talk about it. So I had to go back to my files. And I found a little bit about Edith today looking in newspapers and censuses. You saw that picture of her when she was 40. You know, I think of her like that. She never had kids. Her husband, and she moved around the West a lot. He was a park ranger. He was an engineer. He drafted that design, I'm sure. And I think they just were kind of free spirits. They were very interesting. They never had kids, as I said, and it went to a nephew, as I recall. But that was some of the most fun we've ever had, is finding those quilts. And I can't imagine what you thought about when you found that quilt and you got to buy it.
Where is it now, Merikay? Where is the Rowley quilt?
It's in the exhibit.
No, it belongs to
At
the
Boston,
museum.
it belongs to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts.
They have it now.
Is that
so
where you gave it, or did you pass it on somewhere else in between?
No.
What happened to it?
They
asked to
purchased
buy
it from me.
Okay,
They asked to buy it, and she sold it
that was nice.
because you know you have to.
I do miss it, but
But it's in a great home.
yeah, they've already conserved it, and it's exhibited, and
it's in an exhibit that is really getting major notice. They have specifically focused their collecting on quilts that have really good histories and stories that go with them. So they're not just looking at them as art, they're looking at the whole package. So I think it's a really good place to put them.
And the exhibit is really fascinating. My mother, Robin Clark, I am not Robin Clark, but I am at her computer this evening, gave me a copy of the catalog for my birthday. And so I've had a chance to look through it a bit. And it's just a wonderful approach, because it's the really historic and the real up to the really modern, and also looking at textile traditions from non-Anglo-American traditions as well, which I think is so important, and saying, you know, there are things that we should be looking at outside of the usual range of, you know, pieced and applique quilts that we all know and love, but, you know, there's stuff beyond the borders of those definitions. And so I think it's an exciting exhibit on many, many levels. I can't wait to see it.
What do you think it's going to, what do you think the impact of it's going to be in light of what we were talking about? You know, I think about going to the Esprit collection. I mean, that was an amazing and a huge impact on me, that Oakland, that Julie, you did. And I mean, and the G's Bend, when I saw it in Atlanta at the High Museum, whoa. I mean,
And the
it just,
Holstein show in
the
1974.
Holstein show, and those that we've seen at Nebraska. I mean, there have been some amazing quilt shows.
That changed your mind.
This
You know, and there's
exhibit,
quilts in women's lives. You know, I was
Quilts in
buying
women's
quilts.
lives.
I was
this
buying quilts. I didn't care who made them. I was an art student. And when I saw that there were stories behind them, it like went, oh, I should have asked who made it. I just bought it because it looked like one of those that Alex was talking about.
All evolve. We all evolve and we influence each other, you know?
But the important thing about this exhibit is that it's getting noticed in the art magazines.
That's what I was hoping you were going to say. Yeah.
Yeah. And so
outside the quilt world to
right,
understand the
exactly.
value of
It's,
quilts.
I think it's gonna bring a new a new appreciation.
Increased audience, more
An increased
sophisticated.
audience,
What we do is we
increased
take people where they're at. They go, oh, I like quilts. And then we try and
Well,
expose
It's
to,
getting us all some respect.
lots of
is
stuff.
what it's getting.
Well, I want to
Who's
say
got a
something.
quick kid?
I'm going to say, I
Okay,
get
let's hear it.
talking
Let's hear
stick. I think the whole Bisa Butler thing, and I'm so glad that was rolled into there, like what just happened in Chicago, right?
Right.
And it's my understanding, like Julie, your Quilts in Women's Life exhibit, Bisa's has exploded. And it's getting across that whole chasm, which is so important to do. I mean, so important. And Julie, I just want to say, in 76 was the Quilts in Women's Lives. I wasn't a quilter yet, but I was at that exhibit. So you were there, girl.
Glad we're still here, but we're still here, Alex.
Yeah.
We're doing it.
Well, we're gonna say bye-bye. And if you have questions, put them up on our Facebook page. We'll give you a card. And we'll see you next month.
Thank you for joining
Thank you.
us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alex, for being our sew it all.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks for coming.
You're wonderful.
All right.
Bye, you guys.
Did you know you can watch our previous episodes on Vimeo? Vimeo.com/quiltdistrict/VOD_pages. Or you can search for the 6 know-it-alls when you go to the main page of Vimeo.com. You can also catch our first 3 episodes, which are free, on our YouTube channel. You can go directly to our YouTube channel, or you can go to youtube.com and search for the 6 know-it-alls. You can also find all the updates and links to previous episodes on quiltdistrict.com. Go to quiltdistrict.com and then the 6 know-it-alls tab, and there you'll find all the upcoming episode information, as well as the background on how the 6 know-it-alls got started and some biography information on all of the know-it-alls. You'll also want to be sure you put your email address in here so that you can get notified of upcoming events straight to your email inbox.
And I'm harping on this because lighting is so important to understanding the seasonal rhythms of quilting in this early period and why it began to change in the 19th century.
But that's not the way we use it, just to stick it in there. And so often you will find some turkey red pieces just put in there for a little flair. Even this one has a little bit of red down there, although that's a wool.
This is one quilt that I wanted to talk about today because we just were able to add it to the collection last year. Yeah, it was on loan for many years from the family. And some of you know the quilt maker Anna Catherine, known as Catherine Hummel Markey Garnhart of Frederick, Maryland. And thanks to my predecessor, Nancy Gibson, we now know of 10 quilts made by Markey Garnhart. And we now own 3.
Yes.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And that is very interesting that it's made for the wife of a minister. And I have never heard of the lady sewing group being called a circle of industry. So that's quite interesting. I wonder if it's belongs to that denomination, if there are others that call themselves something similar.
So I just wanted to show how the designs of these bed rugs relate to whole cloth quilt and other types of quilts. So here we have one of the foot bed rugs, and here we have a whole cloth quilt that was made by Olive Curtis Baker in Connecticut. And the stitching of this whole cloth quilt is basically pretty much the same idea as you see in the bed rug.
The thing is, and this goes back to Lynn too with the bed rugs. If we were looking at men's work, if we were looking at ceramics like graffiti plates or painted chests, we wouldn't be thinking of it as a hobby.